The old alarm clock buzzed at 5:30 a.m., just like it had every morning for the past 3 years. Eleanor rolled over in her narrow bed, staring at the cracked ceiling of her small apartment. The paint was peeling near the corner where the roof leaked last winter, and she made a mental note to ask the landlord about it again. Though she knew he probably wouldn't listen, she pulled herself up slowly, her joints creaking from yesterday's work. Cleaning floors and emptying trash cans wasn't easy on a 42-year-old body, but it paid the bills. Barely, but it paid them. Eleanor shuffled to her tiny kitchen and put the kettle on. While waiting for the water to boil, she looked out her window at the gray morning sky. Rain was coming again. Her reflection caught her eye in the window glass. When had she started looking so tired? When had the lines around her eyes gotten so deep? She touched her face gently, remembering when people used to tell her she glowed when she performed. That felt like a lifetime ago now. The kettle whistled, pulling her back to the present. She made her simple breakfast of toast and tea, the same meal she'd had every morning since moving to this apartment. As she ate, her eyes drifted to the corner where an old piano bench sat, covered with a faded sheet. She hadn't lifted that sheet in months. By 7 a.m., Eleanor was walking down the quiet street toward the Riverside Community Center. Her worn sneakers squeaked slightly on the wet pavement as she pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. The cardigan was brown and shapeless, bought from a thrift store years ago. It had a small hole near the left elbow that she'd been meaning to fix, but somehow never found the time. The community center was a large, brick building that had seen better days. Paint chipped from the window frames, and the front steps had cracks running through them like spider webs. But inside, it was warm and welcoming. This place had become her second home. Even if most people barely noticed she was there. Eleanor used her key to enter through the back door, the one reserved for staff. The hallways were quiet at this hour, smelling faintly of the cleaning products she'd used yesterday. She made her way to the small closet that served as her office. Really just a place to store her supplies and eat lunch. She was pulling on her cleaning gloves when she heard quick footsteps in the hallway. Mrs. Henderson, the center's director, appeared in the doorway looking frazzled. Her usually neat hair was messy, and she was holding her phone in one hand while juggling a stack of papers with the other. "Eleanor, thank goodness you're here early," Mrs. Henderson said, slightly out of breath. "I have a huge problem, and I'm hoping you might be able to help." Eleanor set down her gloves and gave Mrs. Henderson her full attention. In the 3 years she'd worked here, the director had always been kind to her. She remembered Eleanor's birthday, asked about her health, and treated her like a real person, not just the cleaning lady. "What's wrong?" Eleanor asked, her voice soft and concerned. Mrs. Henderson ran her free hand through her hair. "Our piano teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, just called in sick. She has the flu and can't come in today. I have 15 students coming for lessons, and their parents will be furious if I cancel at the last minute. Some of them drive here from across town." Eleanor nodded, understanding the problem but not sure how she could help. "I remember when you started working here," Mrs. Henderson continued. "You mentioned that you had some experience with piano. I know it's not your job, but could you possibly help out? Just for today? I'll pay you extra, of course." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. She had mentioned piano experience during her job interview, but she'd been very careful about how she said it. She'd simply told Mrs. Henderson that she knew how to play and left it at that. I don't know if I'm qualified to teach," Eleanor said, her hands unconsciously fidgeting with the hem of her cardigan. "Oh, it's nothing complicated," Mrs. Henderson assured her. "These are mostly beginners. A few children learning their first songs, some older folks who always wanted to learn piano. Very basic stuff, scales, simple melodies. I'm sure you could handle it." Eleanor felt a familiar tightness in her chest. She hadn't sat at a piano with other people watching in over 20 years. The thought made her palms sweat. "What if I mess up?" she asked quietly. Mrs. Henderson's expression softened. "Eleanor, you're one of the most careful, thoughtful people I know. You pay attention to every detail in your work. I trust you completely, and like I said, it's just for today." The truth was much more complicated than Mrs. Henderson could imagine. Eleanor hadn't just learned to play piano as a hobby or taken lessons as a child. She had been what people called a prodigy, though she'd always hated that word. It made her sound like a circus act instead of a serious musician. She'd started playing when she was 4, after her grandmother noticed her humming complex melodies she'd heard on the radio. By age 7, she was performing in local competitions. By 12, she was traveling to perform in other cities. At 16, she'd been accepted to the most prestigious music school in the country, but life had other plans. Her mother's illness had started slowly, just some forgetfulness and confusion. By the time Eleanor was 22, her mother needed full-time care. There was no money for nurses, no other family to help. Eleanor had made the choice to give up her career and become a caregiver. For 20 years, she'd watched her mother slowly fade away while her own musical dreams gathered dust. She'd sold her good piano to pay for medical bills. She'd turned down performance opportunities to stay home. She'd watched her peers become famous musicians, while she learned to change bedsheets and cook soft foods. When her mother passed away 3 years ago, Eleanor had felt lost. She was 39 years old, with no recent work experience, no savings, and no clear path forward. The job at the community center had been a lifeline, something to keep her busy and pay the rent. "Eleanor?" Mrs. Henderson's voice brought her back to the present. "Are you okay? You look pale." "Sorry, I was just thinking," Eleanor said, forcing a smile. "What time do the lessons start?" "The first student comes at 9 a.m. That gives you about an hour to look at the lesson plans and get comfortable with the piano in the music room." Eleanor took a deep breath. How could she explain that she didn't need to get comfortable with the piano? That she could probably play any piece of music Mrs. Henderson could find? That her fingers remembered things her mind had tried to forget? "Okay," she said simply. "I'll do my best." Mrs. Henderson's face lit up with relief. "Thank you so much, Eleanor. You're a lifesaver. The music room is down the hall, 3rd door on the right. Ms. Rodriguez keeps her lesson plans in the folder on top of the piano." As Mrs. Henderson hurried away to deal with her other morning crises, Eleanor stood alone in her supply closet. She looked at her cleaning gloves, still lying on the shelf where she'd left them. Today, she wouldn't need them. She made her way down the familiar hallway, but this time she wasn't pushing a cart full of cleaning supplies. Her hands were empty, and they were trembling slightly. When she reached the music room, she paused with her hand on the doorknob. Through the small window in the door, she could see the piano. It was an old, upright, probably 40 years old, with scratches on the bench and music stains on the top. Not the grand piano she'd once played on stage, but a piano nonetheless. Eleanor opened the door and stepped inside. The room smelled like old wood and sheet music. Sunlight streamed through the windows, creating patterns on the worn carpet. She walked slowly to the piano, her footsteps echoing in the quiet room. The lesson plans were exactly where Mrs. Henderson had said they'd be. Eleanor picked up the folder and flipped through the pages. Beginning scales in C major. Simple songs like Twinkle, Little Star, and Mary Had a Little Lamb. Exercise books for tiny fingers just learning to find the keys. She sat down on the piano bench and lifted the lid that covered the keys. The black and white keys looked the same as they always had, unchanged by time or circumstances. Eleanor placed her hands gently on the keys, not pressing down, just feeling their familiar smoothness. Her fingers wanted to move, to play something real, something beautiful. But she held back. Today she would be what Mrs. Henderson needed her to be, a simple substitute teacher helping out in an emergency. Nothing more, nothing less. Eleanor opened the beginner's book and began to practice the simple songs she would teach. Her fingers felt clumsy playing such basic music, like a poet trying to write with crayon. But she persisted, reminding herself that this was just temporary, just one day. Outside, the rain had started to fall, tapping gently against the windows. Eleanor played Twinkle, Little Star for the 5th time, preparing herself for a day of pretending to be ordinary. Eleanor had been practicing simple scales for about 20 minutes when she heard voices in the hallway. Her hands froze over the keys as she recognized the sharp, authoritative tone of Patricia Wells, the head of the music department. Eleanor had cleaned Patricia's office many times over the past 3 years, always trying to be invisible while the woman worked at her desk, correcting student papers with red ink and muttering about declining standards. The voices grew louder as they approached the music room. Eleanor quickly closed the beginner's book and stood up from the piano bench, smoothing down her cardigan. She didn't want to be caught sitting at the piano like she belonged there. The door swung open, and Patricia Wells entered first. She was a tall, thin woman in her 50s with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her clothes were always pressed perfectly, and she carried herself like someone who had never doubted her own importance. Behind her came James Crawford, a man in his early 40s who taught intermediate piano. He wore expensive suits and had a habit of mentioning his degree from the music conservatory in every conversation. The third person to enter was Susan Kim, who handled the advanced students. She was younger than the other two, maybe 35, but she tried to make up for it by being extra serious about everything. She always spoke in a clipped, professional tone that made even simple conversations sound like business meetings. "So," Patricia said, looking Eleanor up and down like she was inspecting a piece of furniture, "you're our emergency replacement?" Eleanor felt her cheeks flush. "Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Henderson asked me to help out today." James let out a small laugh. "Help out, that's one way to put it." He walked over to the piano and ran his finger along the top, checking for dust. "I suppose you know where middle C is, at least." Yes, I know where middle C is," Eleanor said quietly. Susan crossed her arms and tilted her head. "What exactly is your musical background?" "Mrs. Henderson mentioned you had some piano experience, but she was rather vague about the details." Eleanor's heart started beating faster. This was exactly what she'd been afraid of. "I've played piano for a while. Nothing fancy, just—" "You?" "No, basic stuff." "Basic stuff," Patricia repeated slowly, as if the words tasted bad in her mouth. "And you think that qualifies you to teach our students?" "I'm just helping out for today," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mrs. Henderson said it was mostly beginners." James walked over to the piano bench and sat down. He cracked his knuckles dramatically and began playing a complicated piece that Eleanor recognized as Bach. His technique was solid, though she noticed he was rushing the tempo slightly. When he finished, he looked up at Eleanor with a smug expression. "That's the level of skill our students are accustomed to," he said. "Can you play anything like that?" Eleanor's fingers tingled with the urge to sit down and show him how Bach was really supposed to sound. But she forced herself to stay still. "I mostly know simple songs," she said. "Children's songs, basic melodies." Susan shook her head. "This is ridiculous. These are paying customers, not charity cases. Their parents expect professional instruction." Now," Patricia said, though her tone suggested she agreed completely. "I'm sure Eleanor is doing her best. But perhaps it would be better if we stayed to supervise. We can't have the students' progress compromised by amateur instruction." The word amateur hit Eleanor like a slap. She had performed in concert halls, had been reviewed in newspapers, had been offered recording contracts. But here she was, being talked down to by people who probably couldn't play half the pieces she knew by heart. "We'll stay for the first few lessons," James announced, settling into a chair like he was doing everyone a huge favor. "Consider it a learning experience for you, Eleanor. You can observe how real piano instruction is done." Eleanor wanted to disappear. She thought about Mrs. Henderson's desperate face this morning, about the students who were counting on having their lessons, about the extra money she desperately needed. She took a deep breath and nodded. That's very kind of you," she managed to say. Susan walked over to the piano and began shuffling through the sheet music. "Good heavens, look at this mess. No organization at all. How can students learn properly in this chaos?" She began arranging the papers in neat piles, tutting disapprovingly. "The previous teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, is usually very organized." Eleanor said softly, trying to defend someone who wasn't there. "Rodriguez?" Patricia sniffed. "Well, she's competent enough for the beginners, I suppose. but she lacks the classical training that serious music education requires. Eleanor bit her tongue. She knew Ms. Rodriguez was an excellent teacher who genuinely cared about her students. She'd seen the woman staying late to help struggling kids, bringing in extra music books from home. Always encouraging and patient. James stood up and walked around the room, examining the decorations on the walls. This room could use some proper classical influences. Look at these posters. Music is fun, and every child is musical. Where are the portraits of the great composers? Where's the respect for tradition? It's a community center, Eleanor said quietly. The goal is to make music accessible to everyone. Accessible, Susan repeated with a slight laugh. That's the problem with modern music education. Everyone thinks they deserve to learn regardless of talent or dedication. In my day, you had to prove yourself worthy of instruction. Eleanor felt her jaw clench. She remembered being 8 years old, practicing scales until her fingers bled because she was so determined to get them perfect. She remembered the hours of practice, the sacrifices her family had made, the pure joy she'd felt when she finally mastered a difficult piece. I think music should be for everyone, she said, her voice a little stronger now. Not everyone needs to be a concert pianist. Some people just want to play for fun or to relax or to connect with something beautiful. Patricia raised an eyebrow. How noble. The fun doesn't pay the bills, Eleanor. Professional standards do. The first student arrived at exactly 9 a.m., saving Eleanor from having to respond. It was a little girl, maybe 7 years old, with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile. Her mother dropped her off with a quick kiss and a promise to be back in 30 minutes. Hi, I'm Lucy, the girl said brightly. Are you my new teacher? Eleanor's heart melted a little. I'm Eleanor. I'm just helping out today while Miss Rodriguez is sick. Oh, okay. Lucy climbed up onto the piano bench, her feet dangling well above the floor. I've been practicing my scales like Ms. Rodriguez taught me. Want to hear? Before Eleanor could answer, Lucy began playing a simple C major scale. Her fingering was a bit awkward and she played too fast, but she was clearly proud of her progress. That's wonderful, Lucy, Eleanor said genuinely. You've been practicing hard. James cleared his throat loudly. Actually, Lucy, your hand position is all wrong. Your wrists are too low, and you're not using proper finger technique. He walked over to the piano. Here, let me show you the correct way. Lucy's smile faded as James began repositioning her hands. Like this? She asked uncertainly. Better, but still not quite right. Eleanor, you need to be more observant about these technical details. Poor hand position will create bad habits that are very difficult to break later. Eleanor watched Lucy's confidence shrink with each correction. The joy that had been on the child's face when she'd played her scale was completely gone now. Lucy, Eleanor said gently, why don't you play the song you were working on with Ms. Rodriguez? I'd love to hear it. Lucy looked uncertain, glancing between Eleanor and James. It's just Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, she said quietly. It's probably too easy. Nothing is too easy if you're learning, Eleanor said. Please play it for me. Lucy began the simple melody, her small fingers finding the keys carefully. She made a few mistakes, but she kept going, her confidence returning slightly as she played. When she finished, Eleanor clapped softly. That was beautiful, Lucy. I could tell you've been practicing. Patricia leaned over and whispered something to Susan, who nodded and rolled her eyes. Eleanor caught the gesture and felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. Lucy, James said, let's work on your rhythm. You're not keeping steady time? He began clapping a rigid beat. 1, 2, 3, 4. Try to match this exactly. For the next 20 minutes, Eleanor watched as the three teachers turned Lucy's lesson into a series of corrections and criticisms. The little girl grew quieter and quieter, her earlier enthusiasm completely crushed. When Lucy's mother came to pick her up, the child ran to her without looking back at the piano. How did it go, sweetheart? Her mother asked. Lucy just shrugged. Okay, I guess. As they left, Eleanor felt sick to her stomach. This wasn't teaching. This was destroying a child's love of music. She thought about her own early lessons, how Her first teacher had encouraged her to explore, to play with the music, to find joy in it before worrying about perfect technique. "Well," Patricia said as the door closed behind Lucy and her mother, "that was painful to watch. Eleanor, you need to be much more assertive about corrections. The child will never improve if you just praise everything she does." "She's 7 years old," Eleanor said quietly. "She's just learning to love music." "Love doesn't matter if she's learning incorrectly," Susan said firmly. By lunchtime, Eleanor felt like she'd been through a war. 5 more students had come and gone, and each lesson had been the same painful experience. The 3 teachers hovered around her like vultures, correcting everything she said, interrupting her gentle encouragement with harsh criticism, and making every child feel like they weren't good enough. There was Tommy, a 9-year-old who was so excited to play Happy Birthday for his grandmother's party next week. James had stopped him halfway through to lecture about his posture, completely killing the boy's enthusiasm. There was Mrs. Chung, a 70-year-old woman who'd always dreamed of playing piano and had finally found the courage to start lessons. Susan had made her feel embarrassed about her slow finger movements, suggesting that maybe she was too old to develop proper technique. Each time Eleanor tried to offer encouragement or focus on what the students were doing, well, one of the teachers would jump in with corrections. She felt like a puppet, going through the motions while the real teaching happened around her. During the lunch break, Eleanor sat alone in the small staff kitchen, picking at a sandwich she'd brought from home. She could hear the 3 teachers talking in the next room, their voices carrying through the thin walls. "This is worse than I thought," Patricia was saying. "She has no authority, no presence. The students don't respect her at all." "Did you see how she let that old woman play with completely wrong fingering?" Susan added. "She's actually making them worse," James laughed. "My favorite part was when she told that boy his happy birthday sounded nice." Nice? It was a disaster. No rhythm, no dynamics, no musical understanding whatsoever. Eleanor's hands trembled as she held her sandwich. She wanted to march in there and tell them exactly what she thought of their teaching methods. She wanted to explain that music wasn't about perfect technique for beginners. It was about joy, expression, and building confidence, but she couldn't. She was just the janitor, just the emergency substitute who didn't know any better. "I think we need to test her," Patricia continued. "If she's going to work here, even temporarily, we need to know what she can actually do." "What do you mean?" Susan asked. "I mean, we need to see if she can actually play piano herself. Anyone can supervise beginners pressing keys, but a real teacher needs to demonstrate proper technique." Eleanor's stomach dropped. She put down her sandwich, no longer hungry. "That's brilliant," James said, his voice getting excited. "We could ask her to play something challenging. When she fails, we'll have proof that she's not qualified." "What piece should we use?" Susan asked. Eleanor could hear papers rustling, probably sheet music being sorted through. "Here's perfect," Patricia said. "Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. It's one of the most difficult pieces in the classical repertoire. If she can't play it, we'll have every right to ask Mrs. Henderson to find a real substitute." Eleanor's heart started racing. She knew that piece. She knew it better than she knew her own name. It had been one of her signature pieces during her brief professional career. She'd performed it at her final recital before leaving music school. And it had received a standing ovation. "But what if she refuses to play it?" Susan asked. "Then we'll know she's not confident in her abilities," James replied. "Either way, we win." Eleanor stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. She needed air, needed to get away from their voices. She walked quickly to the back door and stepped outside into the small courtyard behind the building. The fresh air helped, but her mind was spinning. She could play that piece. She could play it perfectly. But if she did, everything would change. Her careful disguise would be shattered, and she'd have to explain who she really was, why she was working as a janitor, why she'd been hiding her abilities. She thought about her mother, about the choice she'd made 20 years ago. Her mother had been so proud of her musical talent, had sacrificed so much to pay for lessons and instruments. "You have a gift?" her mother used to say. Don't waste it. But Eleanor hadn't wasted it. She'd used it to care for the person who mattered most. She'd traded her career for her mother's comfort, her dreams for her family's needs. It had been the right choice, even if it hurt. Now, standing in the courtyard, she felt torn between two worlds. She could keep pretending to be ordinary, let them humiliate her, and finish out the day. Or she could show them who she really was and deal with the consequences. Before she could decide, the back door opened and Patricia stepped out. "There you are," Patricia said. "We've been looking for you. The afternoon lessons start in 10 minutes. Eleanor followed her back inside, her feet feeling heavy. In the music room, she found James and Susan arranging chairs in a semicircle, like they were preparing for a performance. "Eleanor," Patricia said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "we've been talking and we think it's time for a proper evaluation?" "Evaluation?" Eleanor asked, though she already knew what was coming. "We need to assess your skill level," James explained. "If you're going to teach here, even temporarily, we need to know what you can actually do." Susan walked over to the piano and placed a thick book of sheet music on the stand. "We've selected a piece that will give us a good sense of your abilities." Eleanor walked slowly to the piano, her legs feeling like they were made of lead. She looked at the sheet music and felt a jolt of recognition. There it was, Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. The piece that had once been her triumph, now being used as her test. "This piece," Patricia said, settling into one of the chairs, "requires years of advanced training to play properly. It's one of the most technically demanding works in the classical repertoire." Eleanor stared at the music. She could hear the piece in her mind, every note, every phrase, every subtle dynamic change. Her fingers knew exactly where to go, how to shape each melody, how to build to the dramatic climaxes. "Of course, we don't expect you to play it perfectly," James said with false kindness. "But if you can manage even the first page adequately, we'll know you have some real training. And if you can't," Susan added, "well then we'll know where you stand." Eleanor's hands hovered over the keys. She could feel the three teachers watching her, waiting for her to fail. She thought about all the students who would come this afternoon, all the young people who just wanted to learn music. She thought about Lucy's crushed spirit, about Tommy's excitement being squashed, about Mrs. Chun being made to feel too old and slow. "I'm not sure I should ... Eleanor began, her voice barely a whisper. "Of course you shouldn't," Patricia said quickly. "This piece is far beyond your level. We understand that." "We're not trying to embarrass you," James added, though his tone suggested otherwise. "We just need to establish some realistic expectations." Eleanor looked at the music again. 20 years ago, she had played this piece for a room full of music critics and professors. They had called her interpretation breathtaking and mature beyond her years. The review in the music journal had said she had the touch of an angel and the soul of a poet. But that was 20 years ago. That was before her mother's illness, before the bills and the caregiving and the slow forgetting of who she used to be. That was before she became invisible, before she learned to hide her light under a bushel. "Just try the opening," Susan encouraged. "Even if you can only play a few measures, we'll get a sense of your technique." Eleanor's fingers trembled as she placed them on the keys. She could feel the familiar cool smoothness of the ivory, the slight give of the keys under her touch. For a moment she was transported back to her childhood, to the first time she'd sat at a piano and felt the magic of making music. "The opening is actually quite simple," James said condescendingly. "It's just a gentle melody. Even a beginner could probably manage it." That comment stung. The opening of the ballade was deceptively simple, but it required enormous control and sensitivity to play well. It was like a quiet conversation that gradually revealed deep emotions underneath. Eleanor started, then stopped. She looked at the three teachers, at their expectant faces, at their barely concealed smug anticipation of her failure. She thought about Mrs. Henderson's trust in her, about the students who deserved better than what they'd been getting. "I'll try," she said finally. Patricia, James, and Susan exchanged glances. They settled back in their chairs, clearly expecting to be entertained by her struggles. Eleanor adjusted the piano bench. Her movements careful and deliberate, she placed her feet on the floor, straightened her back, and lifted her hands to the keys. For a moment, she just sat there, feeling the weight of 20 years of silence pressing down on her dot. Then she looked at the music one more time, though she didn't need to. She knew every note by heart, could play the entire piece from memory. With her eyes closed, but she wasn't ready to reveal that yet. "Remember," James said quietly, "this is just to see what you can do. Don't worry about making mistakes." Eleanor nodded, though she wasn't listening anymore. She was remembering the last time she'd played this piece, at her final recital before leaving school. Her mother had been in the audience, tears streaming down her face with pride. After the performance, her mother had hugged her and whispered, "You were born to make music, my dear. Never forget that." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, gathering her courage. When she opened them, something had changed. The first note that came from the piano was so soft and pure that it seemed to hang in the air like a whisper. Eleanor's touch was feather-light, drawing out a sound that was both delicate and deeply emotional. The opening of Chopin's Ballade? No, one began as it always did, with a simple melody that seemed almost too gentle to be important, but something was different about Eleanor. Gone was the hunched posture, the nervous fidgeting, the apologetic voice. She sat at the piano with the poise of someone who belonged there, someone who had been born to make music. Her fingers curved naturally over the keys, her wrists floating at exactly the right height, her whole body in perfect alignment. Patricia, James, and Susan watched with growing confusion. This didn't look like a woman who was struggling with an impossible piece. This looked like, well, like a real pianist. The melody continued, each note placed with mathematical precision but human warmth. Eleanor's left hand joined in, adding a gentle bass line that supported the singing melody without overpowering it. Her breathing was slow and controlled, her face peaceful, almost serene. "She's actually playing it," Susan whispered to James, who was leaning forward in his chair. "The opening isn't that hard," James whispered back, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Wait until she gets to the difficult parts." Eleanor seemed to be in her own world now. The music room, the watching teachers, the years of hiding, all of it faded away. There was only the piano, the music, and the pure joy of making something beautiful. Her fingers moved with the kind of natural grace that couldn't be taught, only born. The melody began to grow more complex, weaving through different keys and colors. Eleanor's right hand danced across the keys while her left hand provided a rich, rolling accompaniment. Every note was crystal clear, every phrase shaped. With the kind of musical intelligence that takes decades to develop, Patricia's mouth fell open slightly. She had been expecting to hear a struggling amateur, someone who would stumble through a few measures before giving up in embarrassment. Instead, she was listening to playing that was professional, more than professional. It was extraordinary. The piece continued to unfold, and Eleanor's transformation became more complete with each passing moment. Her movements were fluid and confident, her interpretation deeply personal yet technically flawless. When the music called for power, she delivered it without strain. When it needed tenderness, her touch became impossibly gentle. "This is impossible," James muttered, but his voice was lost in the music that filled the room. Eleanor reached the first major climax of the piece, where the melody soars above a churning accompaniment. Her left hand played rapid, rolling patterns while her right hand sang out the melody with passionate intensity. The dynamic control was breathtaking. She could make the piano whisper secrets or roar with emotion. Sometimes, within the same phrase, tears began to stream down Eleanor's face, but her playing never wavered. It was as if 20 years of suppressed emotion were pouring out through her fingertips. Every note carried the weight of dreams deferred, of sacrifices made, of a gift that had been hidden away for too long. The three teachers sat in stunned silence. This wasn't just competent playing, this was the kind of artistry they had studied, but never quite achieved themselves. Every technical challenge in the piece was handled with ease. Every musical idea brought to vivid life. Susan gripped the arms of her chair. She had performed this piece herself in college, had struggled with its technical demands for months. But Eleanor was playing it like she had written it herself. Like every note was a word in her native language, the music continued to build, moving through the various sections of the ballade with increasing complexity. Eleanor's fingers flew across the keys and passages that would challenge even advanced students, but she made them look effortless. Her understanding of the piece was complete, not just the notes, but the emotional journey. The story that Chopin had embedded in the music. James found himself leaning forward, caught up in the performance despite himself. He had always prided himself on his technical skill, his conservatory training, his knowledge of classical repertoire. But listening to Eleanor play, he realized he had never truly understood what music could be. This wasn't just playing notes. This was speaking in a language that went straight to the heart. As the piece moved into its most technically demanding section, Eleanor's playing became even more focused and intense. Her hands moved independently, creating multiple layers of sound that wove together like a complex tapestry. The rapid octaves that usually gave pianists trouble flowed from her fingers like water. The delicate trills and ornaments sparkled like jewels. Patricia felt her world shifting. For years, she had been the authority on music at the community center. She had set the standards, made the judgments, decided who was worthy of teaching and who wasn't. But the woman she had dismissed as an amateur janitor was playing with a level of artistry that Patricia had only dreamed of achieving. The emotional climax of the piece approached, and Eleanor's playing became even more passionate. Her whole body swayed with the music, her face reflecting every emotion the piece demanded. When the melody soared to its highest point, she played with such intensity that the room seemed to vibrate with feeling. "My God," Susan whispered, her voice barely audible. "Who is she?" Eleanor was completely lost in the music now. This was the piece she had played for her final recital, the performance that had earned her a standing ovation and glowing reviews. But playing it now, after 20 years of silence, felt like coming home after a long journey. The technical passages that had been designed to trip her up were handled with casual mastery. Her fingers found every note with perfect accuracy. Her rhythm was rock solid, her phrasing was mature and deeply musical. It was clear that she wasn't just playing from memory, she was interpreting, creating, bringing her own voice to Chopin's masterpiece. James's face had gone pale. He was beginning to understand that they had made a terrible mistake. This wasn't a simple woman who cleaned floors. This was a musician of the highest caliber, someone whose abilities far exceeded anything they had imagined. The piece built to its final climax, and Eleanor's playing reached levels of intensity that made the small upright piano sound like a concert grand. Her left hand thundered through powerful bass passages, while her right hand flew across the keys in brilliant cascades of notes. The dynamics ranged from whisper-soft to powerfully dramatic, sometimes changing within a single phrase. As the final section approached, Eleanor's tears flowed more freely. This piece represented everything she had given up, everything she had lost, everything she had been hiding. But it also represented who she really was, deep down beneath the years of invisibility and self-doubt. The last few measures were played with exquisite tenderness, as if Eleanor was saying goodbye to something precious. Her touch became impossibly gentle, each note floating in the air like a prayer. The final chord was held just long enough, then released into perfect silence. For a moment nobody moved. Eleanor's hands remained on the keys, her eyes closed, her breathing slow and deep. The three teachers sat frozen in their chairs, their minds struggling to process what they had just witnessed. The silence stretched on, heavy with the weight of revelation. Finally, Eleanor lifted her hands from the keys and placed them in her lap. She wiped the tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand, her movements slow and deliberate. When she opened her eyes, she looked different. The timid, apologetic woman was gone, replaced by someone who knew exactly who she was and what she could do. She turned to face the three teachers, and for the first time all day her gaze was steady and direct. "I believe that was the entire piece," she said quietly, her voice strong and clear. "Did that meet your expectations?" The three teachers stared at her in complete shock, their minds racing to understand what had just happened. The woman they had dismissed, mocked, and tested had just delivered a performance that was nothing short of magnificent. Eleanor stood up from the piano bench, smoothing down her cardigan with hands that were no longer trembling. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, revealed a truth that could never be hidden again. The reckoning was about to begin. The silence in the room was so thick it felt like something you could touch. Eleanor stood beside the piano, her hands clasped in front of her, waiting. She had asked them a simple question: did that meet your expectations? But none of the three teachers seemed able to form words. Patricia was the first to break. Her mouth opened and closed several times, like a fish gasping for air. Her carefully composed professional mask had completely cracked, revealing the shock and confusion underneath. Finally, she managed to speak, though her voice came out as barely a whisper. Who are you? Eleanor looked at her for a long moment before answering. When she spoke, her voice was calm and steady, completely different from the nervous whisper they had been hearing all day. My name is Eleanor Martinez-Chun, she said. I was a concert pianist. James leaned forward in his chair, his face pale. Was? What do you mean, was? Eleanor walked to the window and looked out at the gray afternoon sky. I mean, I had a career in music once. A long time ago. She turned back to face them. When I was 17, I was featured on the cover of Classical Music Today magazine. They called me the rising star of American piano. I performed with the New York Philharmonic 3 times before I turned 21. Susan's hands were shaking. But you're the janitor. You clean our offices. You empty our trash cans. Yes, Eleanor said simply. I do. I don't understand, Patricia said, her voice stronger now but still confused. If you're some kind of famous pianist, what are you doing here? Eleanor sat down in one of the student chairs, her movements graceful and unhurried. For the first time all day she looked completely comfortable, like she had nothing left to hide. I'm not famous, she said. I never got the chance to be. My mother became ill when I was 22, early onset dementia. The doctors said she needed full-time care, and there was no money for professional caregivers, no family to help. So I made a choice. She paused, looking down at her hands. I gave up my career to take care of the person who had sacrificed everything from my music education. I sold my piano to pay for her medications. I turned down recording contracts to stay home and make sure she was safe. I watched my friends and classmates become the musicians I had dreamed of being while I learned to change diapers and cook soft foods. James ran his hands through his hair, looking lost. But that was how long ago? 20 years, Eleanor said quietly. 20 years of watching my mother slowly forget who I was, who she was, what music had meant to both of us. She died 3 years ago, and I was left with nothing. No recent work experience, no savings, no connections in the music world. I was a 39-year-old woman who had been out of the professional world for 2 decades. Susan was crying now, though she seemed unaware of it. So you took a job as a janitor? Mrs. Henderson was kind enough to hire me, Eleanor said. She didn't care that I had no experience cleaning offices. She saw that I needed work and was willing to give me a chance. This job has kept me alive for the past 3 years. Patricia was staring at Eleanor like she was seeing her for the first time. But why didn't you tell anyone? Why didn't you apply to teach music here? Eleanor's smile was sad and knowing. Because I learned something important during those 20 years. Patricia, I learned that people see what they expect to see. When you look at me, what do you see? Patricia opened her mouth to answer, then closed it. You see a middle-aged woman in a cheap cardigan, Eleanor continued. You see someone with calloused hands and tired eyes. You see the janitor who empties your trash and mops your floors. You don't see someone who might have played Carnegie Hall if life had gone differently? But you could have told us, James protested weakly. Could I? Eleanor asked. When I applied for this job, I did mention that I had piano experience. Mrs. Henderson asked me about it during the interview. But when I said I knew how to play, what did you all assume? That I meant I could plunk out chopsticks and Mary Had a Little Lamb, right? The three teachers exchanged uncomfortable glances. That was exactly what they had assumed. Even today, Eleanor continued, when Mrs. Henderson asked me to substitute, she apologized for asking me to do something outside my qualifications. She's been nothing but kind to me. But even she couldn't imagine that the woman who cleans her office might be capable of more. Susan wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. We were horrible to you today. To you and to those poor students, Eleanor nodded. You were. But not because you knew who I was and chose to be cruel. You were horrible because you had already decided who I was based on what you saw on the surface. And you treated those students the same way you saw beginners, people who weren't serious about music, and you decided they didn't deserve encouragement. That little girl, Patricia said quietly. Lucy, she was so excited about her scales. She was, Eleanor agreed. Until you convinced her that her excitement was wrong, that she should be ashamed of not being perfect right away. James looked sick. We destroyed her confidence. You did. And Mrs. Chen's confidence. And Tommy's joy about playing for his grandmother. Eleanor's voice was firm but not angry. That's what bothers me most about today. Not how you treated me, but how you treated them. Why didn't you stop us? Susan asked. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Because I was afraid. I've been invisible for so long that I forgot how to be seen. I thought if I kept quiet, if I didn't make waves, I could just get through the day and go back to my normal life. But you didn't keep quiet, Patricia said. You played. You showed us who you really are. Eleanor smiled for the first time all day, and it transformed her face completely. I played because I remembered something my mother used to tell me. She said, "You have a gift, Eleanor. Don't waste it." I thought I was honoring her memory by giving up music to care for her. But today I realized I was dishonoring her by hiding who I am. She stood up and walked back to the piano, running her fingers gently over the keys. Music isn't just about perfect technique or following rules. It's about connection, about sharing something beautiful with other people. Those students today, they came here because they wanted to connect with music. And instead of nurturing the desire, you tried to crush it. We were wrong, James said quietly. We were completely wrong. About everything, Patricia added. About you, about teaching, about what music should be. Eleanor turned back to them. I'm not telling you this to make you feel guilty. I'm telling you because those students deserve better. They deserve teachers who see their potential, who encourage their growth, who remember what it felt like to fall in love with music for the first time. Susan stood up shakily. What happens now? Are you going to tell Mrs. Henderson about today? Eleanor considered the question. I don't know. What I do know is that I'm not going back to being invisible. I've hidden my light under a bushel for 20 years, and I'm done with that. She walked to the door, then turned back one more time. Mrs. Henderson offered me extra pay for today. I'm going to suggest she use that money to hire a real substitute teacher, someone who understands that every student, no matter their age or skill level, deserves to be treated with respect and encouragement. Eleanor, Patricia called out. As she reached the door, I'm sorry, we're all sorry. Eleanor paused with her hand on the doorknob. I know you are. But sorry doesn't give Lucy back her joy, or Mrs. Chun her confidence, or Tommy his excitement. If you really want to make amends, remember this feeling the next time you're tempted to judge someone based on appearances. She opened the door and stepped into the hallway, leaving the three teachers alone with their thoughts and their shame. 2 weeks later, Eleanor opened her own music studio in a small space downtown. She painted the walls bright colors and hung up posters that said music is fun and every child is musical. Her first students were Lucy, Tommy, and Mrs. Chun, who had heard through the community center's informal network that there was a new teacher in town who believed in encouragement over criticism. On quiet evenings, when the last student had gone home and the studio was peaceful, Eleanor would sit at her piano and play. Sometimes she played Chopin's Ballade No. 1, remembering the day she stopped hiding and started shining again. But more often she played simple songs, Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, Happy Birthday, and Mary Had a Little Lamb, because She had learned that the most important music is the music that brings people joy, and in those moments, she could feel her mother's presence, proud and smiling, knowing that her daughter had finally learned to use her gift not just for herself, but for everyone who needed to remember that music belongs to us all.